Everybody, I'm Erwin Kuperberg from the Londonderry Conservation Commission, and I'm very happy to greet all of you as you're joining us for this evening's presentation. This evening, we're going to be speaking about the Asian jumping worm, which I think most of you know to be a real threat right now to the gardens and lawns and fields of Vermont. We are very happy this evening that we were able to put on this presentation and invite our speaker, Professor Josef Gorres from the University of Vermont. He's on the Plant and Soil Sciences Department, and he's going to kick things off for us. Before he does, I just want to let you all know that we are recording this program this evening, and it will be available for future viewing on the Londonderry Conservation Commission's YouTube channel. So, and we'll be posting the link for that a little bit later on. But in the meantime, again, we're very pleased to present Professor Gorres, and I'm going to let you take over, Joseph.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, and I don't really have to say that because it's just going to happen. There it is. Before I start, I'd like to thank my grad student, Mariam Nuriain, for all the hard work that she's put into trying to control these worms, or trying to find some way to control them, and she will continue to do this. We've just gotten the okay to hire her as a postdoc, so she'll be with us for another 3 years, and she's going to spend more time on finding a way to control these worms. So thanks, Mariam.
UVM, that guy. I think everyone's muted.
All right, so before I get into the depth of this subject, I'd like to just introduce some research from another place, from the University of Minnesota, where there's a extension professor who has been looking at, and this is probably something you want to know and that you can probably maybe agree with her a little bit on this. She's done some work on the emotional impact of the presence of these earthworms, of these jumping worms. And she found that people are angry, they're frustrated, they're depressed. There's a whole range of negative emotions that go with this. And so I'd like to acknowledge that before we start, because I'm sure that some of you have had some negative feelings about these worms. And I don't really want to drag you down any deeper into the morass of bad feelings. So hopefully I can give a little bit of hope at the end of the talk. But the story of earthworms is in the US, in the northern part of the US, is not all that long, maybe 300 years, 400 years maybe. If you go south of where we are, so you go into Pennsylvania, and south, you will probably find native earthworms. So I'm just trying to say there are native earthworms, and the difference between here and further south is that here we had a glaciation, we had an ice age up to about 10,000 years ago, and that wiped out. That ice age lasted, several tens of thousands of years. So there was no earthworms when the glaciers retreated. And so we don't have any native earthworms here. There are now some worms that made it into the northern part of the US and Canada for a number of reasons that are native to North America, but they're not necessarily native to this area. So how did they get here? So the very first ones that got here were European earthworms. They came with the settlers on big boats. The boats were weighed down by ballast that usually was earth and soil, and that and in that soil there were earthworms. So that was the first wave of invasions into the northern part of North America. And I should also quickly say that they're not just up here in the north, but they're also in the southern parts of the US where there was no glaciation 10,000 years ago. So they're making it into many, many places. What are some of these worms that you might know? There's night crawlers, there's red worm, they look very much like a nightcrawler. They're just a lot shorter. And then red wigglers. So those are probably the most obvious ones that you will have seen or you will have noticed while you're in the garden. There's some others that are much paler than these creatures, and they tend to live further down in the soil. So you don't see them all that often unless you actually put a spade to the soil. So how do these worms move around? European earthworms, as well as the earthworms from Japan and Korea, the jumping worms, they move around, on basically on our wings. We're talking about horticulture, the bait trade, and also vermicomposting is another possible way that they move around. And there's other ways that I will talk about later as well, but these were the ones that everybody was talking about, well, 5 years ago. And then suddenly there was this sudden occurrence of snakeworms or jumping worms in compost, in thermophilic compost, so stuff that's got treated really, really warm. So we'll talk about that later on in this talk. So, but horticulture, composting, the bait trade are the major ways that they get around. They might also get around on your feet, on the soles of your hiking boots. You may want to consider that when you leave your garden. If you have these worms, before you go into a pristine place, try and clean the boots before you go. So this is one of the culprits, Amynthis agrestis, and you see they're sitting on on its loose castings. They're so loose that they're easily eroded from forest soils, but also if you have a garden on a slope, you might lose some soil there as well. And the other thing that I want to point out is this white ring around the collar there. It's called the clitellum, and that is really where their cocoons form. And what else can I say about this? So in order for you to be able to tell whether this is a jumping worm, the worm has to be an adult, and they're adults when you see this ring around the collar. I'd say July, August, when you see the first ones of these, and then a lot of them in September, October. And so the distinguishing character between the jumping worms and the European earthworms is that this ring actually goes all the way around the body of the jumping worm, and that is not true for the European worms. The other thing that's important is that usually this clitellum is much more offset in color on jumping worms than it is on European earthworms. So clitellum goes all the way around the body, and the colors are very distinctly different between the main body of the worm and the clitellum. So the second wave, this is the ones that we are, of the second wave of worms that have arrived here is the worms that we're talking about, right? So there's different names: snake worm, crazy snake worm, jumper worms, Jersey wrigglers, wood elves, and then there's a bunch of new common names that I haven't learned yet. There's just a couple of weeks ago that I learned about them, but I'm sure that soon they'll be available online, and you can then have new names for each one of the species. So the common names that I have over here are common names for the entire group of snake worms. So they're all snake worms, they're crazy worms. The one that is now preferred is jumping worm or jumper worms. There's a scientific name for them. Of course, there's the species name, Amynthis agrestis, Amynthis tokiensis, Metaphylla hilgendorfi. But if you want to put them together into one big set of worms, you can call them ferritomoids or ferritimoids, depending where you're from. And as I said, the most common species that we're worried about in New England are Amynthis agrestis, Amynthis tokiensis, and Metaphylla hilgendorfi. where do you find them in the Northeast? So here's some of the areas that are georeferenced. So both the white and the dark dots is where they've been identified by researchers. So there's quite a few of them. If you want to know more about the distribution, you can go on to IMAP invasives, or this is an app on your phone that you can download. It's called IMAP invasives, or iNaturalists. It's another app that you can download, and they have maps of where they're found locally, and you can put your finding on there as well. Anyway, what's really important about this map is not only these white and black dots, but also this darker area of gray. That is that's currently thought of as the potential area that they can expand into. So they can go almost all the way up to Hudson Bay. So that's scary, right? Why is that scary? Because you're getting closer and closer to huge amounts of carbon storage in the soil. And if they get in there and the permafrost is slowly going away, then they will consume that carbon that's stored there and put it into the atmosphere as CO2. So if they get there, it's going to be pretty bad. But hopefully that's not going to happen too quickly. These areas are really far off the beaten track. And one of the things that these worms need in order to move is us, like, our transportation system. For long distances, we're talking about trucks, big roads that the trucks are moving on. And so there's not too many of those up here. So there's hope. Canada really had very few sightings until recently. There was one sighting until last year. There was only one sighting in Hamilton, Ontario, on a bowling green, out of all things, Crown Bowling Green. And this year, suddenly people saw them in the Toronto area, gardens, just like where you find them here in Vermont, nurseries, and then down in Niagara Falls, there's another big cluster of these worms. So the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. And then just a few weeks ago, I got a call from a worker a research worker in New Brunswick, in Fredericton, which is their capital, and they have found them there now. So they're expanding their range, or we are noticing them more in areas where we hadn't noticed them before. So Canada is just on the verge of getting as frustrated with them as we are already. So why do we care? So most of us, we have these worms. Then in the garden, we're annoyed. Why are we annoyed about those? First of all, they're different from the other earthworms that seem to also do some damage that we haven't seen before. And then there's, of course, the reason why most of us researchers got really worried about them is because once they get into the woodlands, they do damage there. And so just so that the damage is not just done in the woodlands, it's not just done by the jumping worms, but also by some of the European earthworms. So even your grandparents' worms are damaging the forests. What is the problem with these worms? Not just all these earthworms that are invasive here in the Northeast, and that includes things like the nightcrawler, the redworm, the roseworm, and all those worms that are from Eurasia, I should say, are all also damaging the forest ecosystems. So Lee Fröhlich, who is at the University of Minnesota, has written this really interesting paper called Sideswiped: Ecological Cascades Emanating from Earthworm Invasions. So ecological cascades are things where there's one event in a woodland or in a lake, and that event is setting off a whole bunch of different events. And so for earthworms, the invasion into a forest will change a lot of things. So first of all, it changes the soil structure. So the bulk density increases, the organic horizon disappears. So that organic horizon is that what we sometimes call duff layer. So it's this spongy area that has lots of roots and mycorrhizae in there, lots of fungi. That's where a lot of the nutrient cycling occurs in the forest. And so, going straight from here, from this box to here are the nutrients, NPK, calcium, magnesium, water. And then there's, of course, changes in temperature as well. And that will alter what the microbes are doing. So bacteria and fungi that are turning over some of the organic materials. And that has an effect on the habitat of other individual creatures. So on other species, birds, salamanders, some of the decomposers. And that in turn has an effect on the plant community. And that will have an effect on other species as well. So this is what is happening locally where the earthworm has invaded. But there's effects on society. And so there might be different disease dynamics. And some of those actually don't sound so bad. So you have some researchers tell us that if you have earthworms that consume the litter layer, we're going to have fewer ticks. And if you have fewer ticks, you likely have less Lyme disease. But there's also that once the earthworms have changed the soil structure and thereby the vegetation, it's likely that there's more invasive plant species coming in that do not have any more competitors in that forest. So you get more invasive species. Then you have, conservation commissions going out there and ripping them out and putting the old, the original vegetation back. And the big question is that actually helpful, right? So, yeah, it's helpful to bring back to restore the vegetation to its original state. But will that, without taking care of the earthworms, will you actually have a positive result? Will that restored vegetation stick around? There might be an impact on sales of nursery goods, right? So that's a societal impact. And I've already had some nurseries talk to me about that. There's more and more customers that ask about these worms and whether there's a worm-free product that they can sell. Soil and water quality are changing. There's climate change effects. So there's more CO2 and more nitrous oxide being emitted from some areas that have earthworms. And then there may also be an effect on fire dynamics. That might be positive because if you have less organic matter, you might have less fuel for forest fires. So what does it all start with? It starts with the soil being modified, right? And so I'm once again here in big red letters, I'm saying, and it's not just the jumping worms, but the jumping worms make changes to the soil that are very different from the ones that European earthworms are making. And I'm not saying that one or the other is better. I'm just saying that there's the change occurs. So on the bottom left-hand corner, you see an organic horizon the way we should see it in our forests, at least in our deciduous forests. It's very spongy. You notice that you might even see some porous structures in here where water can be held. It looks very fibrous. And this is actually where the seed bank of a lot of the plants are, right in this layer. And it is a place where a lot of nutrients are turned over. So that's where some of the tree roots are, the shrub roots, definitely some of the herbaceous species are rooted in here. So it's a really important layer for forest ecology. And you notice that right below this layer is actually a very light layer. And so this has hardly got any organic matter in it. It's a particular forest soil. It's not all forest soils look like that, but this is a particular one. And because there's no organic matter in it, there's very little nutrient cycling happening here. Okay, so this is what we really want. And this is what we get when we have jumping worms. So this typical granular casting layer that can be 5 to 10 centimeters deep. So very, very deep. The castings are super loose, and so they can be eroded relatively easily. And then on the bottom right-hand corner here of this slide, you see what happens when European earthworms can't get in there. They produce a very dense A horizon. So this is no longer an O horizon. This is now called an A horizon because it's got more mineral in it than it has organic matter in it. And because it's so dense, it's also a bad place for a seed bank and for rooting. So these two layers have similar effects, but they accomplish those effects in different ways. So less seed bank, less germination. Those are the big things. And so in the end, you get this. So the effect on the vegetation is quite striking. So if you go to Camel Summit, you climb up there, you see a very dense shrub layer. You have, if you go out there in the springtime, you probably see a lot of herbaceous plants, and contrast that with what you see on the right-hand side here, a forest invaded this is also sugar bush, invaded at the Horticultural Research Center in South Burlington. So hardly any understory. You see a few saplings here, and they're probably there because the deer hasn't gotten around to eating them. So this is what's happening. It's the earthworms depleting or changing the soil so that there's less of a seed bank, which means that there's less food for deer to eat, and whatever is left is going to be food for the deer, right? So the deer comes in and says, where's my juicy herbaceous layer that I graze on? And then they just see maple seedlings and such like. So they go for that. And so you now have not only do the earthworms depleted, but also these herds of deer going through there, getting the rest of it. So it's not all the earthworms. It's not all earthworms that do this, but it's that those big forages that come through after the earthworms have finished with their job in the forest. Other creatures that are affected, so birds, especially ground nesting birds, wood thrush, ovenbird, some of the groundhogs can be affected. So ground nesting birds rely on the cover of the vegetation, the shrub layer, the herbaceous layer, to hide the nests from nest predators. Red-backed salamanders are affected as well. And then anything that eats these worms might be affected because the worms accumulate toxic trace metals. And then there's other decomposers, smaller ones, and wild plants that are affected as well. Maple regeneration. So we love our maple syrup, and well, in 100 years time, maybe we don't have that many maples anymore for a couple of reasons. One is climate change, and the other one are these worms. So if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, this is a graph that's a composite of about 50 sampled sites all across New England and into New York. If you look at that, you notice that there's the y-axis is labeled as number of saplings, and it goes from 0 to 8. And then on the x-axis, we have Amynthus species, so the three main species, Lumbricus terrestris, that's the common nightcrawler, or no earthworms. So for Amynthus species, we have roughly on average, a half a sapling per square meter. For Lumbricus terrestris, or the nightcrawler, we have about 3, and then for no earthworms, we have about between 6 and 7. So you can see how this is per square meter. So you can see how the jumping worms really do quite a bit of damage and prevent regeneration of the maple forests. So what kind of damage is observed in horticulture? There's drought symptoms, there's turf detached from soil, and there were some first red flags in the New York Times in 2007, where there was a couple, that Barbara and Robert Tiffany, that are growing. They have a huge garden of hostas, and they noticed that the hostas were shrinking. Basically, the hostas were not in good shape in many of the places on their property. And then they found gazillions of worms. They talked to Cindy Hale, who was a researcher earthworm researcher in Minnesota, and she came to look at them, and she found that all these worms were snake worms. And so the Tiffany's lost quite a bit of their stock. And I'm not sure what they do now, but they had a big problem with snake worms that, for one reason or another, really did a job on their hostas. The Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry and Cornell University report that there's severe drought symptoms, probably because the soils are altered in the pots. So these guys are talking about pots, potted plants. And when you talk to folks in the business, they tell you that if they have these worms in the pots, sometimes you can just pull the plants right out. There's no resistance. And that sometimes the bottom of the pot is totally empty. The worms having fed on the growing medium. And then Cornell is kind of saying, well, they could also damage the roots of plants in nurseries, gardens. And I'm not sure whether they damage the roots. The roots might be damaged simply because the worms have fed all the way around them, and so they're dangling in air, and so that might cause the damage. We had a cilantro experiment, and we saw very simple symptoms like death and destruction in this experiment. So right here on the left-hand side, you see pots that had no amynthus in their pots, and then in pro-grow potting medium. And on the right-hand side, you see pots where the cilantro was planted into castings that were 2 weeks old. So basically, we put the pro-grow into the pots, and then we put the amynthus in there, and we waited 2 weeks before we put the amynthus, so the cilantro plugs, into those pots. And there was stunted growth. And if you look carefully over here, there's dead plants, and these guys over here in the back are on the way out as well. So this is about the same time that these plants had to grow. So 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 weeks, I think it was, in both cases. So if you plant something into these castings, not all the plants will do well. If you look at this more closely, you notice there's necrosis, there's stunted growth. The roots are kind of out of the potting mix. It looks pretty indecent for anybody who likes cilantro, right? So you don't want to grow your cilantro in these pots with these snake worms in them. Here's a picture of, on the right hand side, there's a picture of cilantro that was planted at the same time that the worms were added to the pots, and there you have variable results. So there's a dead one here, but some of the other plants look pretty good for being, with the earthworms. So variable results when the plugs and the worms get into the pots at the same time. These are the 3 species of interest here in Vermont. Metaphylla hilgendorfi, it's this worm here. If you turn it over, it actually is more like this color. So it's on the other side. Metaphylla hilgendorfi is actually darker. Amynthus agrestis and Amynthus tokiensis, and kind of differ in size, but there's a lot of overlap. You can't really tell them by size all that well. So if you wanted to identify them, the easiest one to identify is Metaphylla hilgendorfi. And Metaphylla hilgendorfi has these two spots on its bottom side, just about 5 segments away from the clitellum. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's 2 spots, and you can see them pretty well with the naked eye. So the first question that you want when you find a worm that you want to ask, if you find a worm you want to identify it as a pheretomoid or jumping worm, is does the clitellum go all the way around its body? If it does, yes, then you probably have a pheretomoid and not a European earthworm. So pheretomoids, then you can probably break them down into size classes. And I said earlier that it's kind of iffy, but if you have a very, very small worm that is shorter than 3 inches and it's long and slim, then likely you have Amynthus tokiensis. And this goes for when you have to have that clitellum showing. If it doesn't show the clitellum, then you can't really tell. If it's longer than 3 inches, then you have 2 choices. Either it's that Metaphylla hilgendorfi, it's got these 2 dots, or it's Amynthus agrestis. It doesn't have those 2 dots. There's a really good key that describes this a little bit better by Chang et al. And you can see down here, it's linked to the paper. We're not going to go through this, but this is essentially, have a look at it when you visit the website. That's another way of looking at it. So the life cycle is quite interesting. It's not like a typical annual plant where you have the plant, it produces its seed, it throws the seed down, the next year the plant comes back. It's sort of an annual worm because the worms themselves only last for 6-7 months. And then in the wintertime, they survive as cocoons. The thing is that these cocoons can last for longer than 1 year. So cocoons that were produced last August, most of them will hatch this year, but some of them will go on until next year. And so that is a big problem for anybody who wants to control them, because yeah, you can probably control the worms relatively easily by collecting them, or if we have some pixie dust, you can put the pixie dust on there, the magic powder that kills the worms, but it may not kill the cocoons. So that's a problem. And we have this thing, a cocoon bank, just like a seed bank. What is their phenology? So the first ones you'll probably start seeing at the beginning of April. So a couple of weeks from now, I will be going out looking at woodland soils, trying to find some of those worms. If you have a garden that's irrigated or that's mulched, that gets warm quicker than forests, then you might already be able to see some of these worms. They're tiny. They're probably 3/4 of an inch at the moment, very thin, very small, most likely in the mulch on a wet day and in the soil on a dry day. They move vertically to get to the place where it's either the most organic matter or the most moisture, depending. If it's a moist day, they go into the organic matter at the top. If it's a dry day and the mulch is dried out, then they will go into the soil and seek out moisture. They need moisture. So anyway, you might be able to find some of them. The way you can tell them from other worms at this stage is that even when they're as small as 3/4 of an inch long, you put them in your hand and you agitate them a little bit, they start bouncing around just like the big ones. So they really bounce around in your hand. You have to agitate them. They will sit there until you kind of touch their backside or their nose or something, and then start bouncing around in your hand. Anyway, so around beginning of April, you see the first ones, and then their numbers rise and rise and rise. And, you know, one year, 2019, I think this was, we had something like, what is that divided by 9? So we had some like 30 plus worms per square foot in the wall. That's the largest number we have ever seen. And that happened around mid-May. And that's probably when you probably see your peak in your garden. And it's always the same thing that happens in the springtime. The worms reach their peak when they're still juveniles. And then you get a decline in their numbers as they move towards adulthood. And one of the reasons for that is that it gets warmer towards the summer, it gets drier, so you get some mortality there. And then by the time, you know, June comes around, mid-June, there's a lot of the leaf litter is gone because the juveniles have fed on it. So the numbers go down because they're hot, they're dry, or they're hungry. Then sometime at the beginning of July, all the way through August, you might see the first adults emerge. So the first time that you see that ring around the collar, right? So that means that sometimes you see the first one in the beginning of July. Sometimes you see them at the mid-August. So you can't really tell. Most likely when it's a dry or cool summer, you see them later. And so once the first adults are out, the numbers go up, the adult numbers go up, and then you probably find sometime in August, end of August, beginning of September, that you have half of them are adults, and then in October all of them are adults, unless you have a second hatching, which can come either from the cocoon bank or from the first. So if you have the first adults in the beginning of July, and you have a nice, warm, moist summer, you probably get a second peak. Let me show you one right here. There's like a second peak, and that's new hatchlings. And you find that in nurseries frequently that there is a second clutch hatch, if you want. And the nice thing about the second clutch is that they probably don't make it into adulthood, and so they won't contribute to the cocoon production. And right here you see a few cocoons. That's what they look like. They're pretty much spherical, and when they are in moist soil, they're actually pretty turgid, and you can actually bounce them like a bouncy ball. And they're not very big, so we're talking about a 1/10 of an inch to about an 1/8 of an inch. So how do they get through the winter and drought? They will dehydrate. So when they dehydrate, there's no ice crystals forming in the embryos because there's no moisture to do that, and that allows that embryo to survive the winter time. And this is what the cocoons look like when they're dehydrated, to look like deflated soccer balls. If it gets warmer or moister, then they inflate again, so they imbibe moisture, and so they rehydrate. And that's then they once again they look like what I showed you before. So they're ready to hatch year-round. So you find them hatch in the wintertime. So when there's like a warm day, like today, in the middle of January, which we can sometimes get like a 50-degree Fahrenheit day, they will hatch. So they hatch all the year round. And so what you see here on the right-hand side, you see the percentage of embryos that are ready to hatch. And ready to hatch are these yellow parts of the bar. So it can be a pretty large chunk of creatures, embryos that are ready to hatch in December, January, February. So they hatch all the time. Cocoon bank, we're talking about 1,000. This is just one species here on the left-hand side, number of cocoons per square meter. So you're talking about 1,000 and more per species, all the year round. And then you have, something like 10, 20, 30% that are ready to hatch at any point in time. So cocoons will make controlling these worms a multi-year enterprise. Cocoons are really good protecting the worm from all sorts of evil. And we're starting new trials now to try out this idea that if we have these dehydrated cocoons, can we add some of our biocontrol fungal spores to these dehydrated cocoons and see whether they make it into the cocoon itself, and whether that will increase the mortality rate of the cocoons, of the embryos in the cocoons. It may not be any good at all to put them on these hydrated cocoons, because there's just nothing that gets into that cocoon. So our big question is, will the cocoons imbibe the spore solution, and will the embryos die as a result of that? How do they move around? So I already mentioned horticulture and recreation, but there's compost and there's mulch and there's plant exchanges. So I got an email the other day from a extension person in Connecticut, and she sent me a newspaper article where they were talking about these worms and talking about the mulch. And there was a mulch producer, and she said, "I'm so angry with people that keep telling us that there is these snake worms in the mulch," and she doesn't believe it. But I've seen them in the mulch, not just mulch that I've had in my garden for a while, but mulch that is being delivered. And likewise with the compost, some of the composters stick their head in the sand or in the compost and say, we don't have any problems. But there's more and more emails and calls coming to the master gardener phone lines that say, what do we do? We have these worms that have come in the mulch. So really important, big problem. So the other thing that you have to worry about is plant exchanges. If you're a member of a garden club and you do plant exchanges, there's ways to do this more safely than in pots. So you can maybe do this bare root, or collect the seeds, or have cuttings or something like that. That will help with keeping them from moving around. And recreation, I already mentioned, hiking might be one way of doing this. Earth moving, anything kind of earth moving thing, even big machines that are used in harvesting forest trees. If they're moved without cleaning them, then you have soil attached to the to the machine, and that soil might have cocoons in them. So cleaning everything up would be really important. So here's just one example of, this is from a few years back actually. Purchased 20 bags of some compost, common compost here in Vermont, and spread them in the garden. She didn't notice the worms at the time. The following year she saw them. And what is more important is that she opened an intact bag of this compost, and she found worms in them. So beware. And we'll talk about how we can deal with this later. One way, Act 148. One way that things move around is, Act 148. I love it and I hate it. I love it because, we have to recycle organic materials just to have more sustainable agriculture or sustainable gardens. But I hate it because that neighborhood there that you see in blue that are blocked out is close to where I live, and they have these worms. And so they're really good at raking their gardens in the fall, and they put them in bags, they take them to the transfer station. And at the transfer station, there's a lot of this leaf material. And they're giving it away. They're saying it's great leaf mulch, so bring it to your garden. And of course, if there's earthworms in that leaf mulch and you haven't gotten those worms yet, and you take some of that leaf mulch to improve your garden soil, then there's a good chance that you also get a snake worm delivered to you. And then, going from this one transfer station, you get it into all sorts of different gardens. So you say, well, how can they possibly survive hot temperatures of composting? Well, they do die at 38 degrees Celsius, which is 104, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And most composters bring their piles up to 160. So a lot hotter than what these worms can do. But in windrow composting, the outside of the soil is at ambient temperature, and worms move in that direction. They don't wait until the compost pile is really hot. They leave that hot zone and they go into the cooler areas. Excuse me. The other place that is really vulnerable. So here's a windrow. Let's say the windrow gets really, really hot and all the worms die. Well, if you now bring the material from the windrow to this curing area where the compost is allowed to cool down before it's sold on, then any kind of worms that are on the property will invade that curing pile, and then that way it gets into the bags and the back of a truck and comes to your garden. And the thing about that is, well, you know, if the composter is serious about keeping the worms out, then they will defend this compost curing area, put a trench around it, put worm fences up, etc. You can be much better if you have an aerated static pile, so that the air is forced through that, and you get a much more even heating through that, especially if you put another layer of organic material around it that keeps the heat in that pile. A lot more uniform, hot material in this, but they still have the same problem. When they cool it down and you have worms on the property, then the worms are likely to get in there. Can they be controlled? What do we tell panic callers? Well, we usually say don't panic. Don't panic. Breathe. Really important. So we'd like to distinguish between two kinds of people, the ones that have them and the ones that don't have them. And if you haven't gotten them, try not to get them, right? So obviously, everybody is trying to do this. And you can do this by propagating things from seed and cuttings. You can exchange plants bare root. You can solarize soil and soil materials that you buy in, and let's say you buy some compost, you can solarize that. But you know how to do the cutting and the seed and planting things, so I will skip this. But solarizing really could be really very helpful when you bring in mulch and if you bring in compost. And the way you do this, so go cheap. You don't have to have much to solarize things. So I use plastic drop cloth, not necessarily this brand, but I have plastic painted drop cloth, and I make a sandwich. I take part of this drop cloth and I put it on the ground, and then I put the mulch on top of that. And I need the ground cloth, because if I don't put something there, the worms that are there will escape into the soil, that they can dig, right? So, and you don't have to go very far below in the soil in order to get to cooler areas. And then I put another drop cloth on top of that. I tuck in that top drop cloth underneath the compost, and then I pull up the sides of the bottom cloth, and that's just there so that the worms have a hard time to escape. The escape artists, you really want to make it hard for them. It can be about 10 to 15 feet long. It should not be thicker than 8 inches, and you should have it in the sun for. So as of May, when the sun gets a little stronger, you can have it in the sun for 2 days, and most likely all these worms will die in those 2 days. Temperatures reach something like 150 degrees Fahrenheit, much higher than 104 that you need to kill things. So you may want to check the temperatures as you go along through the 2 days to see whether you actually get to that temperature. So the downside is it kills some of the microorganisms that are beneficial, but they recover probably pretty quickly. If you buy compost in plastic bags, you can try and solarize them in the bags. If you got them already, then things become a little bit more complicated. And emotional. So don't let anybody point fingers at you, for starters. Well, there's cultural practices and physical practices. So one thing that seems to discourage earthworms of any kind is tillage. So if you have a patch that is invaded and it doesn't have annuals in it, or it doesn't have perennials in it, then you can probably rototill that area. And so that will probably take care of some of the worms. Not all of them, but probably some of them. You want to till peak worm season, right? So this is sometime mid-May to beginning of June in most gardens, maybe a little later for shaded gardens. So till then, if you till before that, you have mainly cocoons, and the cocoons are not bothered. And if you do it afterwards, you most likely have adults, and they have already started producing cocoons. So your window is sometime between mid-May and maybe mid-June, and possibly all the way up, if it's a dry year, possibly all the way up to beginning of July. So that's the window when you can do this. It'll reduce the numbers. It will not get rid of them completely. If you have other areas that you cannot till, then you probably have more some of the worms invade that area again, but it'll be a lot fewer worms in that area. So there's some suggestions that are really new from University of Minnesota. So Angela Gupta, that I mentioned earlier, is a forestry extension professor at the University of Minnesota. And she's tried out native prairie mix. So she's taken native prairie mix and she put it in her garden in a certain area. And she's been checking for the past 2 years whether she has worms in her garden, jumping worms at that. And she's been she's been digging in the area that she has under this prairie seed mix. And she finds that she hasn't found any snake worms in there, even though areas right adjacent to it have snake worms in them. So that might be a really neat thing. Have a little garden, or even maybe one of those prairie plantings might even be some kind of buffer for these worms to come into areas that you want to defend against these worms. And then she says that cocoa peat, coconut fiber, is also seems to be. So she's done tests with about 20 people in Minnesota, and they put the core out, and they say they see a reduced number of snake worms in the area that they're mulched with core. Core is expensive, so but if it works, there might be certain areas where you really want to get rid of the worms. So before we have some really good treatment that we can put out there every year to reduce the numbers everywhere, maybe some areas that you value highly, maybe that's where you want to put the core. One thing that bothers me about the core is that you can actually buy core from vermicomposters that say, oh, this is great for worm bedding. So, take this with a pinch of salt. The native prairie mix is probably the better choice. Biocontrol. So we are working with 2 fungi. One is Botanigard, is the commercial name, and the other one is Metmaster. And so they have things in there called entomopathogenic fungi. Botanigard is Bovaria bassiana. It's a fungus that's used to control insects in greenhouses and in horticulture. It's already certified for that purpose. It's not certified for earthworms yet, but we're working on it. And so we had some greenhouse experiments, or quite a few of them by now. I'll just share one of them with you. So what we do is we take the Bovaria bassiana and we grow it on millet. So we have this thing called mycotized millet. It's kind of neat. You can still see the millet sort of, but it's outlined by the fungus. And then we apply that to pots. that have earthworms in them. And then we, after 3 weeks, we measure how many of these worms have died. Well, go back. And for the micotized millet, so here's a treatment, 15 grams of millet. There's actually a little bar right here that is just millet by itself. Millet is a great food for worms, by the way. They seem to survive, they love it. But when it's micotized, about 80% of them die in the pot. And you can have 15 grams or 25 grams. When you do no millet, even then, if you put straight Beauveria bassiana on the soil, then you still get about 70%. And if you have nothing in there, then these worms still die, but that's just 20% of their natural sort of death that happens. Why don't they die in this 15-gram millet thing? It's basically because these 15 grams of millet are feeding them. Over here, you have no millet, so there's less valuable food there. I should mention that when I say straight Beauveria bassiana, I mean straight Beauveria bassiana. I don't mean Botanigard. Botanigard has all sorts of filler in it, and it's not very effective if you just put that on there. But straight Beauveria bassiana, when you reculture it, works really well. So we're trying to figure out how to make that Botanigard work better. Maybe apply more and more often. Maybe, I don't know. We'll have some tests this summer. Unlikely solutions. Parasites. So here's a parasite that my friend Joe Schall, he's a parasitologist. He's retired, but he's still working really hard on earthworm parasites now. So this one is called funnel mouth because it's like a funnel. There's some that are called pearl parasites, and you can see them here in this worm. Usually when you have these pearl parasites, you have a red-headed worm with lots of these pearl-looking structure in them. So within them, there's a ton of these pearls contain a lot of parasites, the same species, not the same species as that, but there's only one type of parasite in each one of these pearls. But they don't seem to be killing the worms. So a good parasite doesn't kill the host; it just makes them uncomfortable. Anyway, so that it doesn't seem to reduce the numbers greatly. More interventions. We tried some microbial isolates from dead worms, and they worked really well. But then we don't know, exactly what they are. We know it's their penicillium and staphylococcus and bacillus. You get these mortalities of 100% after 240 hours of incubation. But something like staphylococcus and bacillus might be actually a human pathogen, so we don't like to use those at all. By the way, down here is a cocoon that was invaded by, that was killed by penicillium. You see the fuzzy surface here. More interventions. So some people say, what about flatworms? They kill earthworms, right? Well, flatworms themselves are actually exotic species, so they can be invasive. They're seen more and more often in gardens now, and they're highly toxic, right? So they have pufferfish toxin in them, a neurotoxin, and you don't really want to encourage them to be in the environment because that toxin may not be degraded very quickly. Some lizards are vermivores, but mostly we don't have very many lizards up here. And then there's some birds that eat them. American woodcock is an obligate vermivore, but you really don't want to feed these worms to anything because they're accumulators of toxic trace metals. I had an experiment in Rhode Island when I was still working there that had night crawlers in that experiment, and they were all killed by ants. So maybe bring back some ants. So it's a possibility that they will do something about that. But we haven't run that experiment. So this is something that I should try this summer. I have to find an ant person. So for biocontrol summary, we don't know of any effective predators for the worms. Beauveria bassiana seems to work well. And the other one, the metarhizium.metmaster product also works pretty well. It's known as Metarhizium bruneum now. And then Beauveria bassiana grown on millet works super well. And we're trying to find a way of making your own micotized millet in your in your shed or in your kitchen sink or whatever. So we'll have a protocol for that at the end of the summer, I hope. There's some chemical things. So one of the things that you probably have heard about is, excuse me, I'm going to drink a swig of tea here. You probably have heard about this thing called early bird fertilizer, right? It had saponins in it, and it's no longer being produced, by the way, so don't look for it on the shelf. But that was used in mainly on golf courses and turf production to get rid of earthworms in general. And it's the saponins that do that. So one of the ingredients in soap is a saponin, and it is in many plant species, including the tea tree. So camellia, the one that makes this tea. And so you can buy it from Chinese producers. And that's what went into that Ocean Organics early bird fertilizer. And I think one of the problems is, excuse me, that there's no certified chemical or anything else that's certified for earthworms. So it could be that they don't produce that anymore because it was used off-label. We did some bioassays with plants to see, what about soap? What about vinegar? Do they kill the worms? Does that kill the worms? So here are the results of that. So on the left-hand side of this graph, you have the mycotized millet. And the mortality for the mycotized millet is about 55–60%. These are adult worms. Adult worms don't die as easily as the juveniles. So the previous experiment was with juveniles. And then we have soap right here. And then we have vinegar. So the vinegar worked really well. 70%, 90% of adults killed really quickly, but it also killed the plants. So that's not really what you want to do. Soap also worked pretty well. So, this one here, the 5 milliliters of soap into 5 gallons was not statistically significant in terms of the mortality rates, about 50%, just like these two here. And it was actually not that bad in terms of slowing the growth of the plant at all. It was maybe a few days behind these plants here that didn't get the soap. But then when we went to higher soap solutions, higher concentrations, you still have high mortality of the worms, but the plants had a lot of damage to them and they didn't grow as fast anymore either. So there's that problem. So we've been working on this for about the integrated pest management version of this research, 3-4 years on it. Why is this research so incredibly slow? One is lack of funding from large funding agencies. So we get small amounts of money from here and there that allows us to do this, but the National Science Foundation or the United States Department of Agriculture are not really so interested in funding large research projects with worms in them. We did get a grant from actually the department, the Agency of Agriculture here in Vermont, but it's also just a small amount of money, but it helps. Anything helps. So that's one reason. The other reason is there's only one life cycle per year for these worms, right? So if we want to repeat an experiment, we have to wait until the next year. And then we have to do research on both the worm and the cocoons. If we don't do that, then we're missing a really big part. The cocoons are a survival structure for these worms, right? So that's what keeps them alive in the winter and during droughts. And I suspect that they also have some defenses against chemicals. So that's what slows us down. Chemical control summary: there are no chemicals that are certified, so I always have to say that. Vinegar kills the worms, even at low concentrations, but also kills the plants. Horticultural soaps, by the way, don't kill the worms. They're not saponin soaps, but they do damage the plants, so don't try that. tea tree seed extracts, pellets work really well. You can buy them online, but they're not certified. Then there's some thought that maybe alfalfa pellets as feed will do the trick. And I had there's some horticulturists that swear by that, and I have not had any luck with it. And one of the differences between a horticulturalist and me is I have a very clean lab, where there's not many things that would grow on the alfalfa. And it's possible that a horticulturalist, if they store the alfalfa, that it might get some mildew on it, and maybe that mildew is what kills the plant. So we're gonna do some experiments this summer and see what happens with that. And if any of you are nursery workers and you want to try some of the practices, send me an email and just put in the subject line Amynthis trials VNLA. And then I will contact you and see whether, and then we'll talk and see whether, I tell you all about what you can do, and then you can choose something, or you can say, well, no, I don't really want to do that. It seems like a lot of work. So with that, I ask for questions. Oh, funding. There's 3 concerned citizens out there that gave a lot of money this year. The Hardy Plant Club has been supporting this. The Epley Foundation for Research out of Rhode Island has been funding this. Vermont Agency of Ag, I already told you about that. The specialty crop block grant is doing this. And then the New England Greenhouse Conference has also given money towards this research. And so now I can entertain questions.
Thank you, Professor Gorres, and thank you to all of you who have been here tonight, all the garden clubs that joined in, and all the individuals. So at this time, we're going to take questions, and you're all muted. So if you want to ask a question, please unmute yourself, and we'll try to keep it all in order. Any questions?
Mr. Irwin,
Yes, Steve.
Joe, maybe you answered this question. When do the worms lay eggs? Is it in the fall and they overwinter?
As soon as you see the worms with a clitellum, with that ring around the collar, they will be able to lay or produce cocoons, so egg casings essentially. And so each one of them can produce a cocoon every other day. And so each one of these adults, the earliest ones will be able to produce something like 50 or 60 cocoons through the growing season. But if you don't see any worms with the clitellum, then they're not producing any cocoons. So most of them, I think that the heaviest time for cocoon production is September, October.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Joseph.
Go ahead.
It's Kurt Coles here. I own a nursery in town here, and
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like the best way to somewhat control these worms is to do that rototilling you mentioned, mid-May to mid-June. A lot of people around here like to stay organic, which we try to do also. So
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of other methods that are reasonable at this point. So that's my guess. Is that correct?
Yes. So there are a few other things you can do, right? So if you are producing in pots, then one thing you can do is you can maybe store the pots on a bench, so typical growing bench, and try and worm-proof the legs. Worms can climb,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe something like what you do for squirrels, that you have some kind of funny contraption that's like a funnel-looking thing that with the funnel faces down, that might do it. One of my grad students was able to keep the worms in pots. That's another problem, right? So they like to get out of pots, and when I do my experiments, they don't want to die. They feel uncomfortable to get out. But he put hookup wire, electrical wire around around the top of the pot. He didn't electrify them, by the way.
Oh, wow.
But if you put 2 or 3 of those close, like maybe half an inch apart, they don't seem to be able to get past that obstacle. So that's one thing that you can do. And then one of my colleagues, her dad has a nursery in Canada, and she told him, you know, put the legs of the bench into soapy water, like have like containers and put soapy water in it. But that sounds like, you know, high maintenance.
Yeah, labor intensive,
high maintenance of stuff. So those are things if you grow things in pots. The other thing I guess I would say is, and I just got an email from a nursery in the DC area. They brought in compost last year, and it was infested with these worms, and so they're now already seeing worms in the pots that they planted last year for this year's sales, and they're totally repotting them all in you know, new potting mix that they have solarized.
Wow. Yep.
Right. That's what they're doing. I mean, that's a lot of work. They're talking about. They're saying we're repotting 20,000 plants. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's not something that I would say is feasible in all places. But you know, if you bring in new potting mix is usually sterilized, right? So, but if you bring in compost to make your own potting mix, then you may want to solarize that potting mix before you pot things up.
Okay. Yep.
And you know, I'd love to work with nurseries, see how some of these suggestions work. You know.
Yeah, I'll send you my email address, and we can have a conversation.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.
Right.
Sure.
Thank you, Kurt. Now, Joseph, we have a question submitted through the chat. If we are working in our gardens and collect worms, what is the best way to dispose of them? Is it safe to say we can collect all worms without damaging the environment?
Yes, you can collect all the worms without damaging the environment. Once they're dead, so I suggest there's different ways of doing this. So one way of doing it is to use soapy water. And so, you know, we work with Mrs. Meyer's, that kind of soap. It's got saponins in it. But any kind of dishwashing liquid will probably do. Throw them into soapy water. Have a big 5-gallon pail. Fill it, don't fill it, put maybe a quarter, fill it quarter of the way with that dish washing liquid. So, you know, a couple of spritzes of the soap into maybe 1 gallon of water will do it. So 5-gallon pail, and then you throw your worms in there and they die. And then people say, well, can I safely dispose of them in my compost pile? Wouldn't some of the eggs survive? So no, they wouldn't survive. Once the worm is dead, they're no longer, whatever eggs they might have are not going to be surviving. So you can put that whole thing into your compost pile.
I have 2 questions. First of all, you mentioned that straight Beauveria bassiana is effective. Is that commercially available?
Beauveria bassiana is available through Botanigard. So that's what it's called, Botanigard. And Botanigard has a lot of fillers in it. And my grad student, Mariam, is kind of telling me that those fillers interfere with the action. She's an IPM specialist, so she learned IPM, Integrated Pest Management, was her master's degree, and she's worked in the area, and so she thinks that is what stops the Beauveria bassiana from being effective when you apply it as out of the bag, right? So it comes as powder. You have to put it in water. You have to follow the label. Try and double or triple the concentration. Maybe that's going to work.
But you had mentioned that while the Botanigard is not as effective, the straight version is. So is the straight version available?
So the straight version of that is Mariam takes the Botanigard and she grows the Botanigard on first on waxworm, and then she takes some of the spores that are on the waxworm that they turn totally white. But she takes some of the spores and puts it onto agar, and then she grows that out. And then she takes, if there's anything on the agar that doesn't look like Beauveria bassiana, then she takes another sample of what she thinks is Beauveria bassiana, and she grows it again until you have a pure culture, and then that's what we use. So what we have in mind for homegrown is to produce a liquid with the Beauveria bassiana, the straight Beauveria bassiana pure culture, and then send that around to people that are interested in a syringe that they can use to inoculate millet. And there'll be a protocol that goes with that. How do you sterilize the millet? How do you sterilize the mason jars? We're thinking of mason jars as being one way of growing these things. And then with that pure culture, you can inoculate that millet. So there'll be a protocol that goes with that.
So not easy to do at home.
People have tried it, and I think it's possible. Agar is not that difficult to make. You need petri dishes, you need agar, you need to have sterile conditions. It can be done, but most likely you need us to make it. That's probably a lot easier. But by all means, somebody has to try it at home and see how it works. I'm going to try it at home. I'll be the first guinea pig, and then I'll probably get shouted at by Mariam saying, "Ooh, what did you do? There's some green fuzzy stuff growing on it. It should be totally white. What did you do, Joseph?" We'll see.
Okay, another question. You mentioned that the use of predators was not advisable because of the concentration of toxic metals by the worms. Excuse my ignorance. Is there that much toxic metal in the ground of the typical Vermont garden that's not proximate
Good
to
question.
a commercial business?
So that's a good question. So the forests certainly have a lot of toxic trace metals. Mercury, for example, is still coming down from power stations in the Midwest. Cadmium is part of transportation problems. Lead there's still legacy lead in there from gas that was burnt in cars in the 60s and 70s. So I think that there can be. I think one thing that you can do is you can have a soil test done for toxic trace metals. UVM does that. So it's an extra part. And of course, it costs more money. And there's that, but it's an additional test you can ask to have done.
Okay. Anybody else?
Joseph, I do have one quick question.
Sure.
We have a compost pile that's been going since the fall. Can you overwhelm the worms? We normally start out our gardens in May with 2 or 3 inches of brand new compost. Is that just adding fuel to the fire?
Yep, you're feeding them. It's nice of you, but yep. I mean, it's always a question. What do I do with my compost? Right. So I mean, you have the worms already. Apply the compost. You can try. So once the compost is there, you can try and solarize that patch where you put it. It will at least reduce the number of worms. So wait until the worms are in the compost. Put some painter's drop cloth on it, the milky looking stuff on top, and see what happens. It might actually work. So give it a go.
We've had these worms for a couple of years, and I wouldn't say our gardens are totally annihilated. I mean, we grow vegetables. Our tomatoes weren't that great, but strawberries are terrific. Kale was great. So despite the worms, we still had a pretty good harvest. So
Yeah,
we're
I mean,
learning to live with them.
yeah, but that's the other way. You could say, well, you know, I'm going to live with them until there's something that I can do. There's always one or two plants that will not, you know, varieties that won't like it. But I think it's also something to do with when you plant, whether you already have a lot of castings. I think that's a big deal. Like, so, you know, if you remember those slides of the coriander that I had earlier, the cilantro, you know, it could be that if you plant a little earlier, then maybe you not have that problem, right? So I'm not sure what it's like down your way, but you know, I swear that I could put tomatoes out there sometime in towards the, you know, maybe the third week of May, because it's so much warmer than it used to be. Of course, there's a risk with that. Buy more tomatoes just in case you have to replace them. Buy a 6-pack of each one of them, you know. So.
Okay.
All right, we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, assuming we have the worms in pots already, if we go through the effort of solarizing our composted potting mix, I'm trying to figure out how to keep it clean. So if we've gotten worms out of our pots sitting on ground cloth, if we could figure out how to create moats around the ground cloth field, would that work to some extent?
Yeah, probably. Another possibility is if you put something on the ground, then maybe you can stake it up so that the sides come up. They're climbers, so you would have to have a lot of side come up, maybe, you know, up to I don't know, a foot and a half. You can also, the other thing that might be effective is, this is what I've done in some of my experiments in the forest, is to use a fine screen and so make a what I call a worm fence. Have that screen in the ground. So window screen, for example, would work. Have that in the ground to about 10 centimeters, so 4 inches, and then have 5 or 6 inches above ground. And you can just then staple that to stakes, ground stakes. That might also stop them from getting out or in. And then if you have all that if you have your potting mix on a tarp or something like that, then, you know, if there's anything in the ground, that it will not come into the potting mix. That's what I think might work. And if you have it stored if you have stored, maybe you can store it in such a way that you also put some painted drop cloth over it, so that it's constantly hot, solarized. It's a possibility. I'm not sure whether it will take care of all the problems, but it will certainly reduce the number.
Okay, here's another question on the chat. Can you speak to the most effective methods of raising them out of the soil? Thrumming the soil versus mustard soak?
There's several methods. So mustard is one of them. I think soap will also work. It's a expellent as well as something that kills them. So if you want, so this is yet another thing you could do before you plant. You could probably put soapy water over the soil in that period of time between mid-May and mid-June. So if you plant around Memorial Day, then do it before Memorial Day. Put some soapy water down there over the top. Have it soak in. Leave it for a couple of days, and then irrigate it again, so you dilute the soap down a little bit more, so that you don't have an effect on the plants when you plant them. Does that help? I forgot the question, but I rambled on anyway. I'm a professor. I'm allowed to do that.
Well, the question was the most effective method of raising them out of the
Oh, yeah.
soil, thrumming versus mustard soak. Soak or soap? It says soak. I think maybe it means soap.
Mustard soak. So yeah, you put about an ounce of mustard, dry mustard, into a gallon of water, and then you apply that to the soil, and you'll see the worms come to the surface. There's worm grunting, which is you put in a wooden wedge into the soil, and you keep banging that, and it sets up vibrations that drive some worms to the surface. There's also electroshocking. If anybody remembers the American version of the Godzilla movie with Matthew Broderick, he shows you how to do it. So if you haven't seen that, car battery, 2 metal rods, and it'll bring worms to the surface. I don't necessarily recommend it. You're talking about electricity and potentially a wet soil, right? So don't do that. But that's how some people get worms out of the soil for big juicy night crawlers out of the soil for fishing. People do that, but you only treat a very small area. You can't put those electrodes further apart than maybe 10 inches. So yeah, you'd be very busy. So mustard solution is good. Soap is good, because you can apply those probably with a sprayer. The mustard, well, don't apply the mustard necessarily with a sprayer, because the nozzle probably gets clogged up.
And since you mentioned the use of movies for instruction, all of the Dune movies for using thrumming.
Ah, yeah, great. Why don't you do that?
Those are bigger worms, but yeah.
Yes, they're
And,
bigger
okay,
worms.
anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question here. Yeah. Hello?
Go ahead.
Hi
Yes,
there.
we hear you.
Yeah, I have, I've had some luck with just digging up the ground and pulling out about 1,000 worms and putting them in vinegar.
Yeah, so
Go
you're
very
right.
easily, very easily.
Great observation. They don't go further down than 2 to 4 inches.
Right,
So
right.
you get most of them out of the ground. What I usually do is I get on my knees and I take a trowel and I drag the edge of the trowel over the soil and scrape the soil away to about 3 or 4 inches, and you get most of those
Very
worms.
backbreaking work, but
It is.
it took a couple of hours and I got 1,000 worms out. So we had
Yeah.
quite a few. But I was wondering about the casings, and when you see all the granular dirt, are the eggs in that granular
Yeah.
mix?
They're most likely in that granular mix. There might be a little bit deeper. Some of the worms that survive into November are probably producing cocoons further down. So maybe 4 inches down where it's not so cold, and then you might be out of that layer.
What's the difference between the granular dirt and the egg itself in the dirt there? It's
Yeah. So
tell
the eggs are very round, right? So they are about the same size. Sometimes if you're looking for them and you're sieving the soil and you kind of disrupting the aggregates, so the castings. Sometimes the cocoon is somewhere in the casting. They're very cryptic. They look like the castings, but they're not the castings.
What I want to do next is to use a torch, and that would kill all the dirt, but it would kill the microorganisms too. But it would kill a lot. If I do it, I've got all the worms out of the soil now, but if I use a torch on the dirt that's granular with a blowtorch, I'm thinking that it'll kill the eggs too.
That's a really good question, because you'd be surprised that even in a forest fire that sweeps across a forest at 900 degrees Celsius, was it Fahrenheit? 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's be. I can't remember whether it's 9 Celsius or 9 Fahrenheit. And it's only a quarter of an hour of that in one spot. That heat is not traveling very far in the soil in that quarter of an hour, right? So you would have to keep that blowtorch on that one spot for a long time. So I think you'd be better off on if you have a couple of sunny days coming along to put some drop cloth on and see whether you can heat that soil. So the castings, the cocoons don't move, right? So they're there, but so you can probably heat that soil up above that 38 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit, to a fair depth. Maybe not all the way down to 4 inches, but the top 2 inches are probably going to get pretty warm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have tonight. So I want to thank everybody for their participation. Thank you very much, Professor Gorres, for that very illuminating talk. Some bad news and some good news in there, and we're hoping for better news as your research continues.
I will do my best.
Yes, thank you. And if you all would scroll to the top of the chat, you'll see the link that I published with our YouTube channel, so that you may use that and share that to be able to view this talk on our YouTube channel. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then you don't actually need that anymore. So thank you again on behalf of the Londonderry Conservation Commission. Thank all of you, and Dr. Gorres especially, for tonight's talk.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.